October 17th, 1814. A massive explosion rocks the heart of London. But this wasn't a bomb. It wasn't a terrorist attack. It was beer, and it would leave a trail of death and destruction that seems too insane to be real. 8 people would end up dead, drowned, ... In alcohol, imagine a 15-foot-high wave of dark, frothy porter-beer crashing through the streets, tearing buildings from their foundations. This is the bizarre, tragic, and absolutely true story of the Great London Beer Flood. To understand how this could even happen, we need to go back to London in 1814. The Napoleonic Wars are winding down, and the Industrial Revolution is in full swing. Smokestacks fill the sky, and factories are churning out goods at an unprecedented rate. At the heart of this industrial boom is the Moe and Company Brewery, better known as the Horse Shoe Brewery, located right in the middle of the city. This wasn't just any brewery. It was one of the biggest producers of porter, the dark, heavy beer that was the lifeblood of London's working class. And to make all that porter, they needed vats. But these weren't the shiny steel tanks you see today. These were colossal wooden barrels, bound by massive iron rings. The main vat was a tourist attraction in itself, standing 22 feet tall and holding over 600,000 liters of fermenting beer. That's more than 2 Olympic-sized swimming pools worth of booze in a single wooden container. Now, picture where this industrial giant was located. It wasn't in some isolated industrial park. It was crammed right up against one of London's most notorious slums, the St. Giles Rookery. This was a maze of narrow, unpaved streets, ramshackle tenements, and overcrowded basement dwellings. It was a place of extreme poverty, where entire families lived in single, dark, damp rooms, literally in the shadow of the brewery's giant vats. For months, brewery workers had been noticing a problem. The huge iron hoops that held the main vat together were starting to show signs of stress. One of them had even slipped earlier in the year, but in an era of lax regulations, the repairs were deemed non-urgent. The brewery just kept on brewing. This was a disaster waiting to happen. And then, on that fateful October afternoon, it did. Around 5:30 p.m., a brewery storehouse clerk named George Crick was making his rounds. Suddenly, a deafening crack, like a cannon shot, echoed through the brewery. One of the 200-pound iron hoops on the giant vat had snapped. Crick wasn't overly concerned. This had happened before. He calmly wrote a note to his superior, suggesting it be repaired. But he didn't have time to deliver it. Within minutes, the immense pressure inside the vat became too much. The entire structure catastrophically failed. The explosion was so powerful, it blew a hole through the brewery's thick brick wall, which stood 25 feet high. This initial blast triggered a deadly domino effect. The force of the explosion smashed into the other vats in the brewery, rupturing them one by one. In an instant, 1.47 million liters of beer were unleashed. This wasn't a gentle leak. It was a tsunami. A 15-foot-high tidal wave of dark, sticky porter, moving at an estimated 15 miles per hour, surged out into the narrow streets of St. Giles. The force was unimaginable. It slammed into 2 houses on New Street, reducing them to rubble almost instantly. The wave of beer, debris, and splintered wood then roared down Great Russell Street, flooding everything in its path. The real horror was in the basements. These low-lying homes, already below street level, stood no chance. The beer poured down into them like a waterfall, filling them from floor to ceiling in a matter of seconds. People were swept off their feet in the streets, struggling to stay above the suffocating, alcoholic tide. The air filled with the smell of beer, the sound of collapsing buildings, and the screams of the terrified and the trapped. The human cost of this bizarre disaster was immediate and devastating. In one of the basement rooms, directly in the flood's path, a traditional Irish wake was being held for a 2-year-old boy who had died the day before. Tim O'Hearners, including the boy's mother, and Saville, and 4 other people, were suddenly engulfed by the black wave. They never stood a chance. All 5 drowned in the cellar. Nearby, in another house that was torn apart by the flood, a mother and daughter were having tea. Mary Banfield and her 4-year-old child Hannah were crushed when the walls of their home collapsed around them. In the Tavistock Arms pub, next door to the brewery, the wall gave way, trapping the teenage barmaid Eleanor Cooper under the rubble. She would become the eighth and final victim. As the floodwaters slowly receded, a scene of absolute chaos and heartbreak emerged. Neighbors scrambled over the wreckage, desperately trying to pull survivors from the debris. They used their bare hands to dig through the rubble, trying to reach the cries for help they could hear from beneath. But for many, it was too late. Over the next few days, the bodies were recovered, their clothes and skin stained black by the porter. The entire neighborhood reeked of stale beer and death. But what happened next is perhaps the most bizarre part of the whole story. As news of the beer-soaked disaster spread, a different kind of crowd descended on St. Giles. These weren't rescuers. The slum-mess, desperately poor residents saw the rivers of free alcohol running through their streets as an opportunity. People rushed out with every container they could find. Pans, buckets, even just cupping their hands to scoop up the beer. In the grim aftermath of a tragedy that killed 8 of their neighbors, a macabre party began. People drank the dirty, debris-filled beer directly from the gutters. The inevitable happened. Reports from the time describe several people falling ill from drinking the contaminated liquid, and at least one man, Thomas Marie, reportedly died from alcohol poisoning a few days later after a non-stop drinking binge. The funeral for the victims became a morbid public spectacle, with people paying to see the coffins laid out in a local yard. Meanwhile, the brewery owners, Henry Moe and his partners, were taken to court. It seemed like a clear-cut case of negligence. Their vat had failed, and people had died. But the court case took a shocking turn. The brewery's lawyers argued that the VAT's collapse was not their fault. They claimed it was an act of God, an unforeseeable and unavoidable natural event. Incredibly, the judge and jury agreed. No one at the brewery was held responsible. They were completely cleared of any wrongdoing. But the story gets even more unbelievable. Not only did the brewery owners avoid any liability, they then petitioned Parliament for a tax rebate on the hundreds of thousands of gallons of beer they had lost. And they got it. They received a refund worth thousands of pounds, the equivalent of hundreds of thousands today. The families of the 8 people who died, they received absolutely nothing. The London beer flood may sound like a historical joke, but its legacy is very serious. This disaster, along with others from the Industrial Revolution, highlighted the deadly consequences of unchecked industry and non-existent safety regulations. It became a powerful argument for reformers pushing for new laws to protect both workers and the public. Over time, it contributed to changes in both industrial engineering standards and urban planning, leading to stricter building codes that prevented factories from being built so close to residential areas. The Horse Shoe Brewery itself was repaired and continued to operate for over 100 years, finally being demolished in 1921. Today, the Dominion Theatre stands on the site, with no plaque or memorial to mark the strange and tragic event that occurred there. The beer flood serves as a stark reminder of a time when corporate profit was valued far more than human life, a preventable tragedy that was conveniently dismissed as divine will. So, the next time you hear a strange story from history, remember the day a river of beer flowed through London, leaving death and destruction in its wake. What other bizarre historical disasters do you think we should cover next? Let us know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more forgotten stories from the past.